Good morning. So I'm Tim Drye. I have the fortune to lead Doug, the Data Analysts user group, and to welcome you all to our annual conference. It's a great pleasure, and I hope we go away refreshed and invigorated and enjoying our life within data that little bit more than we did this morning. So hopefully we can stimulate everything. So today I want us to consider when and where we need to go the extra mile, and rather than just using data that falls into our lap, which data quite often does nowadays, we sometimes are motivated to go the extra mile and find new sources of data, work hard to get data, and reap the benefits. So just as a contrast, last year I proposed the idea that we were in danger of making Californian machines. So in trying to not think about diversity and thinking that we were building machines that were androgynous, I think I called them last year, we were in danger of actually being forced on us that they became Californian without us really realizing. And that was because we weren't necessarily assessing the algorithms properly, and particularly not assessing the way the algorithms created errors. So there was all sorts of judgments going on in the background that were being dominated by that small area of American geography. This year, I want to move from the algorithms, as I say, to get us considering the data, which is, I think, an even bigger challenge and an older problem, and one that often gets forgotten nowadays, in that there's a whole bunch of people who think that the data just turns up in a pristine form and will just answer any question we put to it. And my concern at the moment, if you like, or the conjecture, is that this has the possibility of creating childish engines. And I'll give you a little reason why I suggest that might be the case. It comes, I don't know if you've ever come across a thing called the marshmallow test. If I had a bit longer, I'd show you some amusing videos. It's a psychological test usually conducted on children between the ages of 4, 5, and 6. They're put in a room and given a marshmallow and told if they wait 10 minutes, they'll get a second marshmallow. You can look these up on YouTube. Just look up marshmallow test. There's some great videos. And then the camera just stares at each of these children and watches them sort of feel for a marshmallow or suck it or can I have a nibble of it, and various ones fail or not necessarily fail, but come to the conclusion the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush and just eat the marshmallow, because you never know, the second one might not turn up. And the others that turn up later on and get their 2 marshmallows. My concern is that we've become so fixated on fast data and quick results that we're potentially turning people into childish type actions. Wisdom, if you like, has quite often been associated with what gets termed here delayed gratification. And it was in exploring this idea that I came across this magazine called Delayed Gratification. It's published in central London, and it's part of a movement called slow journalism. And their premise is they only write about something that's at least 3 months after the event. So this particular month's article, published in September, was only about things that happened between April and June. And then it's not advertising funded at all. It's all journalistically led and funded, and they go out and do some proper investigation. They also, interestingly, produce some fantastic infographics, which just look quite fun. I managed to get my youngest son involved because they recently, in this particular article, they showed an infographic of the Marvel Universe, which has got absolutely nothing of interest to me, but my younger son loved this route through the Marvel Universe. But go and buy the magazine. I want to encourage people to do it. But I think not only is slow journalism a good idea, but I'd like to advocate sometimes slow analysis, finding data that's slower. And I'll tell you why and hopefully convince you in a few moments. Because I want today in the back of your mind, as these various different examples come up with, have your idea on these two questions. How do I, in my commercial or academic or public sector organisation, present arguments that make us provide a business case, if you call it what you will, for using high-quality relevant data rather than the easy, cheap stuff that's thrown in our lap? How do I know when data is good enough and fit for purpose? And how do we check? And as we're analysts, most of us, I'm going to show you an equation. And I'm going to tell you a little story, because I think this illustrates how this issue about data goes back a long time before the internet. And it's a particular time when I decided that I'd got to advocate a bit more. And I don't know if you remember, but 20-odd years ago, the royal family was in a bit of a crisis. Diana had just died. They'd had the annus horribilis. And not long after, the BBC put up a national debate one Friday night. And they managed to have a telephone poll. In those days, that's the only way they could do it. But they managed to get something like 11 million people to dial in to this poll to see whether they approved of the royal family or not. And I think, someone could put, but I think the idea was there was about 30% voted against the royal family, which was still a sizable, so it's about 4 million people out of the 11 million poll voted against it. Where I really was throwing stuff at the TV was not long afterwards, they then interviewed the head of the RSS and asked him the question, did this poll mean anything? And I thought he was utter fool when he just stood there and did the usual statistical thing of saying, no, it's a biased sample, doesn't mean anything because it was self-selected and all those sorts of things. But this beautiful equation, which is actually really old but gets forgotten, could have been the thing that he went back to, because statisticians became so focused on simple random samples that they had forgotten questions like this, which are a way of analysing the effect of bias in the data. So it's a simple question. I only came across it because of a professor at Harvard called Meng. He does some fantastic work about how nowadays you can apply statistics in real-world data sets. And this one in particular, it links the correlation between what you're sampling and what you're trying to measure. That's the first element, the rho. Sigma, which is the standard variation in the data, and an effect that you get for the size of the data. So the fraction, F, of the data sample that you've managed to capture. So what you've got in this equation is you've got volume, that factor 1 over 1 minus F, which illustrates how much it's worth getting a high proportion of the data. You've got sigma, which is, I relate it to veracity, so that you can reduce your variability by getting data that's more and more relevant. It's always very good to see that, and we'll have some examples of the relevance of data. And I want to argue that correlation is very much connected to velocity. And I'll, just as an illustration, what it does illustrate is if you've got a correlation of about 0.1 and you've managed to capture about 50% of the population, so for Facebook's got active users about 50% of the population. If your effect is about 1.1 correlation, that's the same power or generates the same error as a simple random sample done perfectly of just 100 data points. So it's worth investing in getting 100 data points properly sampled to get the similar type of error as you get from having a fully 50% of the population if you've got a 0.1 correlation. I think it's an amazing calculation. And it goes back, and this is one of the things Meng talks about nowadays, is that nowadays statisticians in particular need to shift their emphasis from thinking about sampling error to thinking about how do you estimate bias in samples, because that enables you to judge when a data set is useful. And so we need to start to educate people, to help to mature people in their data, and not necessarily to look at the equations, but to think of some sort of rules of thumb. And this is when velocity begins to matter. Because I'm quite convinced, and I've seen many examples, of where the faster the data, the bigger the risk, and you can't quantify it, but the bigger the risk that the data is artificially correlated with the thing that you're measuring. So that, and I give an instance often, if you look at website responses to data, if you look at people who respond really quickly to communications, they're a particular type of people who happen to like your particular communication and are reactive to your particular data. So you end up building a whole strategy around people that are responsive to communication. But of course, if they're responsive to your communication, they're responsive to somebody else's. So you'll quite easily have a risk of a higher correlation. You'll also quite easily have a risk if all you ever do is look at your internal data and never look outside. So I'm not saying, and I'm quite a strong advocate of using both those data sets, but there is an appropriate amount of skepticism and a requirement to try and identify what is the scale at which these two internal data sets are correlated with the thing you're trying to measure. And of course, it's very difficult to do that without taking what you might call outside sources, data which isn't present within your own system, because they almost certainly are not correlated. And that's the important thing to identify. It's not to do with the sampling. It just has to be uncorrelated to reduce the systematic errors. So it doesn't have to be random, just uncorrelated. And being delayed helps you to capture items within the data that you don't necessarily have thought of yourself. You very easily, if you're fast and internal, run the danger of having confirmation bias within your analysis, even if you don't try to, and that's a natural human instinct, that if we don't move and force ourselves and advocate using slower and external data, we run the risk of with it until we begin to measure it. So I hope they can become sort of rules of thumb that people become used to. It's more important nowadays because there's so much more access to data and a huge amount of naivety about what data can deliver by chance without the appropriate amount of skepticism. So my hope today is that we contribute in a little bit to just raising the levels of maturity around data that we give, both in the ways that we talk to other people, the way that we encourage them to ask extra questions. And with that, we'll hand over to our first speakers from E.ON, and I hope all of them will challenge you and particularly give you examples of how we can address this and how we can advocate for these new, harder, but more relevant and useful sources of data. So thank you very much for coming along.